Dogsong, Chapter 3. I was round and had great beauty. For that reason, I had no trouble getting husbands. And that was good, because they all died. I had 3 husbands, and they all died before I had 20 summers. The sea took 2 of them when their kayaks were ripped, and a great bear took the third. All I found was his head on the ice. It was hard then, but not bad, although I missed my husbands for a time. But I got a new one, and he lasted. Eskimo woman relating her youth. North and east of the village, the land rose away from the sea in rolling hills that led to mountains. Even in the middle of the winter, the land fought to hold the snow. The short tundra grass gave no foothold, and so often the surface was blown free of snow, and the grass was out all winter. Arctic hares fed in the bare areas, as did ptarmigan, the small white grouse-like birds, sometimes flocking 200 and 300 birds in a single place. Now and then, even in the dark cold of winter, it was possible to see a frozen blue or purple flower, winter flowers. Russell sat on the edge of the sled and looked down at one such flower by his foot. It had 4 petals, and he did not understand how it could have gotten through the fall and into the middle of winter, but it had. And it had grown in beauty for it, the color rich against the cold brown of the grass. Much had changed. Ugrak had talked until he was done, and when he was done, he had fallen silent. It might have taken days and nights, it felt like years, and when he was finished, Russell had fallen asleep, a real sleep this time. He slept without moving, leaning against the wall, and when he awakened, the room was cool, still not cold, and he got up stiffly and stretched. Ugrak was silent with his eyes closed. The lamp burned out. For a moment, Russell thought he was dead, but he was still breathing, and Russell took a deer skin and wrapped it around the old man's shoulders. He knew what to do. From the walls, he took the lances and bow and arrows. He also took a pair of bearskin pants and the squirrel underparka and the deerskin outer parka with the hair on the inside. Some of the hair was brittle on the deerskin, but it was still thick and warm. He did not think of the objects as belonging to him, just thought of them as being what he needed. Ugrak had told him to use what he needed, including the dogs and sled, and Russell followed those thoughts as if they were his own, as in some way they were. He was wearing store pants and a coat, and he took them off and hung them on the pegs. For a moment he stood naked in the cooling room, felt his skin tighten. Then he pulled on the bearskin pants, with his hair out, the soft skin and supple. Ugrak had worked oil into the leather to maintain them as he had taken care of everything. At the top, there was a draw cord, and he pulled it tight. The pants were just slightly large, but the right length. On the wall were sealskin mucklucks. He took them down and felt inside. The grass bottoms were still good, and he pulled them on, tied them up around his calves over the bearskin. Then came the squirrel skin inner parka, with the hair out, soft and fine, like leather silk. Last, he pulled over the outer parka, thick deer hide, with the hair in, and when that was on and shrugged in place, he took down a pair of deer's hide mittens with a shoulder thong and pulled them on. As soon as he was dressed, he went outside before he could heat up. He had to get the sled out of the lean-to on the side of the house and see how much work it needed. The harnesses were also there, and the gang line. It was cold, standing cold. So cold you could spit, and it would bounce. When the wind hit him, he pulled up the hood and tightened the drawstring through the wolverine ruff. The long fur came in around his face and stopped the wind. Then he pulled up the mitten cuffs and felt the air movement through the parka stop. His body brought the temperature up almost immediately. Around the seaside of the house, Ugrak or somebody had made a lean-to. The door had leather hinges and a wooden pin through the latch. Russell pulled the pin and worked the door open against the snow. Inside stood a dog sled, and there were harnesses on a peg of the wall. He reached in and pulled the sled out to examine it more closely. The sky was light now, a gray all-around haze off the sea and out of the clouds at the same time, and he thought he'd never seen anything so beautiful as the sled in the gray light. It was the old kind of sled, the kind they called basket sleds, when the modern white mushers ran the races. They used toboggans made with plastic and bolted together. Ugly little tough sleds. But in the old days, the people used sleds of delicate hardwood lashed with rawhide, all flexible and curved gracefully. Ugruk's was like a carving of a sled, with birch rails down the side and elegant curved stanchions. Around the front was a warped wood brushbow, something he'd never need unless he ran where there were trees. And it had 1/8-inch brass runner shoes that almost looked new. There was a steel snow hook tied to the bridle and a rope gangline with tugs and necklines already in place. He spread it out on the snow and studied everything carefully. The lashing on the sled looked old, but it had been oiled and was in good shape. The rope on the gangline was a corded nylon and looked also to be in top condition. He pulled the harness down and spread them out, and went over them carefully as well. They were clean, had been patched a few times, but were good for all of that. All he needed was a dog team. The harnesses all seemed the same size, so he put them on the tugs, using the small ivory toggles to tie them in. Then he set the snow hook and pulled the gangline out in front of the sled and stopped to see what he had. He had never run a team himself, but he'd seen mushers go by in races. One long-distance race went by the village, and he knew how things should look. He took the lead dog off the chain. It growled at him and raised its hair, but he tightened his grip and paid no attention to the snarl. The dog held back, and Russell had to drag him to the gangline. The dogs had run for Ugruk, but that was more than 2 years earlier. They had not run since for anybody. And this stranger had to earn their respect, earn the run. The leader turned his shoulder in the curve. That meant threat. The curve that meant attack, and lifted his lip to Russell. It was an open challenge, and Russell cuffed him across the head with a stiff hand. Still the dog growled, and now took a cut at Russell's leg, and Russell hit the dog harder. Then a thing happened, a thing from the trance with Ugruk, and he leaned down so his head was over the top of the leader's head, and he growled down at the dog. He did not know why he did this, but he did know for certain what the growl meant. When it was finished, he curved his head over the dog's head, and still, without knowing for sure why, he bit down hard across the bridge of the dog's nose. He bit the dog. The leader growled and flashed teeth, but quickly backed down, and that was the end of it. He stood, too, in harness, pulling the gangline out tight, while Russell turned to bring the rest of the team. The other 4 dogs came nicely and settled into harness, as if they'd been working all along. Russell smiled. It almost looked like a dog team. He had in mind this first time to just take the dogs out on the ice and see what happened. He took no weapons or other gear because he wasn't sure if he could control the team and didn't want to lose anything if the sled flipped. The first run was rough. The dogs ran as a gaggle, wide open, in a tangled bunch and not lined out as they should have been. Russell ran into them with the sled more than once when they stopped, before they could get on the brake, and when they hit the so-called pressure ridges a mile offshore, where the ice from the sea ground almost against the ice and piled up, he almost lost the sled. They tipped him and dragged him on his face for a quarter of a mile before he could get the snow hook set in a crack. When he had stopped them, he put the sled upright and sat it on for a moment to think. It was close to dark, the quick 3-hour day all but gone, and he would have to head back to the village, yet he did not want to leave the run. The wind cut at his cheeks, and he turned his hood away from the force, took the cold. "You will have to know me," he said quietly to the dogs after a time, "just as I will have to know you." 2 of them looked back at him. It was perhaps not an invitation. It was perhaps not a look that meant anything at all, except that they looked back and their eyes caught his eyes, and he knew they would run. He knew they would run. He knew when he put his feet to the sled and took the handlebar in his hands that they would run, and he did not know how he knew this, but only that it was so. When he was on the runners, he reached down and disengaged the snow hook and used the small lip squeak around that Ugruk had told him to use to get the dogs running. They were off so fast he was almost jerked backward off the sled. It wasn't a gaggle now, but a pulling force with all the dogs coordinating to line the sled out of the ice, a silent curve of power out ahead of him. The feeling, he thought, the feeling is that the sled is alive, that I am alive, and the sled is alive, and the snow is alive, and the ice is alive, and we are all part of the same life. He did not try to steer them that first time, and they ran up to the coast on the ice for 3 or 4 miles before their fat caught up with them, and they slowed. When they were down to a trot, tongues slavering off the heat from their run, Russell stopped them again. Ugruk said the leader had been gee-haw trained the same as the white freighters did, to go right on gee, left on haw. Gee! Russell made a loud command, but he needn't have. The lead dog turned off to the right and started out again, back in toward shore. When they got along the beach edge, where the ice was mixed with sand, Russell turned right again and headed back for the village. The dogs automatically headed for Ugruk's house in their chains, and Russell let them go. When they pulled in, he took them out of harnesses and put them back in the chains and went into the house. Ugruk was awake, sitting at the lamp. He had moved. Russell could tell by his position, but he was back, and he smiled when Russell came in. "Did they run for you?" the old man asked. "Did they run for you?" Russell shrugged out of the parkas down to bare skin. He laughed. "They ran, grandfather. They ran for me like the wind." "Ah, that is fine. That is fine." It was a feeling like being alive. The sled flew across the ice, and I was alive with the sled. Yes, yes, that is so. This is how it should be. You are correct. Is there meat left? We should eat meat. The old man laughed. You are a true person. Eat when you are happy. No, we ate it all last time. Get more from the cache. But first, feed the dogs. Give them meat 3 times bigger than your fist. Always take care of the dogs first. The words were not meant to be as a rebuke, but they made Russell stop and think that perhaps he had been inconsiderate. He pulled on the light inner parka and went outside. It took him a few minutes to chop meat for the dogs and to get some of them for themselves. And when he got back in the cabin, Ugruk had the spot in the flame waiting. He had already put snow in the pot to melt, and Russell was mystified as to how the old blind man could have gotten out, found snow, gotten back in to sit without Russell seeing him. Russell put the deer pieces in the pot and took his position on the floor. He had essentially moved in with the old man. Not that it was strange. In the normal Eskimo culture, people moved around on a whim, especially young people. It was as nature as calling old people grandparents, whether they were actually related or not. This is good meat, Ugruk said as the deer cooked, but we need fresh meat. You will have to hunt for us, Russell nodded. I was thinking the same thing, but what should I hunt? Ugruk snorted. Whatever there is. But maybe you should start small. Go out after we eat and sleep, and try to get some hare or ptarmigan. And they had eaten and slept, and Russell had the team out in the hills to hunt fresh meat for the old man, for himself and the old man. He was hunting with a bow, and he had many shots at both hares and ptarmigan, but hadn't hit any yet. The arrows wouldn't fly true, wouldn't go where he wanted them to go. Always they were just under or over or left or right, just enough to miss. On one ptarmigan, he shot 6 times with the round-headed bird arrows, and the bird just sat as the arrows shushed past. Finally, he flew. Russell looked at the dogs. They were all down, but not out of tiredness as much as boredom. The country is nothing for them to see, he thought. It is my mind that is wrong, not the bow. It is my mind. What should I do? He asked. What is it that I am doing wrong? He closed his eyes, and when they were shut, the answer came to him. Ugruk had told him during his trance, had told him how to use the lances and the bow. Look at the center of where the point will go. Look inside the center, the old man had said. And so he pulled the hook and squeaked the team up and ran a few miles over the rolling hills until the team scared up another flock of ptarmigan. This time the dogs saw them and heard them, and he had a good ride until he could get them stopped as they chased the birds. When he finally got them down, he set the hook and took the bow off the sled. The quiver he put over one shoulder, but he kept out 2 of the bird arrows and put one of them in the bow. The birds had flown over a single small ridge, and he followed, walking slowly, keeping his head down as he approached the top of the ridge. Most of them had gone across, but 8 or 10 had landed just past the high point, and 2 of them were hunkered under a small piece of willow, nearly hidden white against white. Russell drew the bow, but Ugruk's advice stopped him. He looked at the nearest bird more closely. Rather than just see the bird, he tried to find the exact spot he wanted the arrow to hit. Then he tried to see in the center of that tiny spot, and he drew and released the bowstring, and the arrow moved across the space, floated across, and took the bird in a shower of feathers, and the commotion frightened the other birds away in a cloud of flying white streaks. Russell ran over to the bird and picked it up. He had killed many ptarmigan with a small rifle that spit the .22, but never one in the old way, with the bow. When you kill the old way, Ugruk had said, it is because the animal wishes to be taken then. You must thank the animal by leaving the head and with food in the mouth. if it's a land animal. With sea animals, you put fresh water in their mouths. He pulled off the head and found some dried berries on a branch and put them in the bird's beak and put the head under the bush. "Thank you for this good meat," he said. "It will be enjoyed." A part of him felt silly for that. He was far enough away from the old way to almost not believe in it. Yet another part of him felt right, more right than he'd been in a long time. It was coming dark as he trudged back to the sled. The dogs were sitting up as he came toward them, and they wagged their tails when they saw the bird. "Some meat," he said to them. "Not much, but a start." A start! He put the bird in the sled bag and tied the bow and quiver back on the sled, pulled the hook, and called the dogs up. He did not want to go back to the village yet. Even if it was too dark to hunt more, he could run out along the tundra and see the country. There was no trail, and he let the dogs have their heads or let the leader run. The rest followed wherever he went. Russell stood easily on the runners and held the handlebar loosely. When he'd first run the dogs, he was tight and rigid, afraid of losing them. But he was quickly coming to realize the sled had a life of its own. It was very flexible, giving and taking the bumps with a flowing motion, and it made gentle sounds. The rawhide lashing points creaked softly, and the runners hummed, a kind of high-pitched sound that was very pleasant to the ear. Riding was more of a matter of fitting onto the sled than trying to control it. With his knees relaxed and his hips loose, he could shift his weight only slightly, and the sled turned with him. It became almost an extension of his body, just as he was becoming more an extension of the dogs. They started down a long slope, across at an angle, perhaps a mile of downhill running, and the snow was packed so they didn't sink in. In seconds, they were running wide open, their tongues flying, their ears laid flat, tails down. Russell kept one foot on the claw brake to keep the sled from running up on them, when a great joy grew within him. The silence was broken by his laugh, but the dogs didn't look back. They drove on down the hill, the sled flying from hummock to hummock, Russell laughing and playing the sled back and forth to miss the larger mounds. Twice it flipped on its side, but he stayed with it, and it bounced back onto its runners, all the time careening down the hill. When they finally reached the bottom, he stopped the team and set the hook. It was then he saw the caribou. She was standing, side to him, part of the gathering darkness, part of all he could see. She had a ghost quality, the light fur of her belly blending with the snow color. He held his breath. Hold for me, he thought. Hold for me, dear. He moved slowly and took the bow from the case. It was still strong from when he was hunting the ptarmigan, and he took out one of the wide ivory-tipped, big-headed arrows and fitted it onto the bow. Inside the center of the caribou, he thought. That's where the arrow must fly. Still she stood, waiting, looking at him and the dogs, and he pulled the bow and released it, and did not see it fly in the dusk, but he knew that it flew as his mind would have it fly. The caribou hunched slightly at the shoulder and took 4 steps and folded down, the front legs bending slowly, almost as if she were going to sleep. The dogs had held silently, but when they saw her hit and going down, it triggered the prey response from the wolf memory, and they went mad. They slammed against the harnesses again and again until the hook jerked out of the snow and the sled came loose, and the team was on the deer in a tangled mess, some tearing at her throat, some at her back legs, some at her belly. Russell ran after them, using the bow as a club, yelling and hitting and throwing them back. He finally got them under control and off the dying caribou. It took 5 more minutes to get them lined out in the opposite direction from the animal, and when he turned back, the deer was dead. He stopped and looked down at her. The feathers of the arrow protruded from just in back of the shoulder. The arrow had gone through the heart. She had died with her head to the east, which was good, and Russell found some of the sweet tundra grass the caribou liked and put it in her mouth. When the ritual was done, he stood away from her, and looked above the deer's head and said, "Thank you for this meat, dear. It will be enjoyed." From the sled back, he took the short knife he'd gotten from Ugruk and made the gut cut from the ribs back and dropped the large stomach. He reached in for the liver and heart and cut them out and set them aside for Ugruk. The old man could get the eyes later. Reaching up and in, he jerked the lungs out and cut them in 5 pieces and gave them to the dogs, only just keeping his hands safe from their lunging, against using the bow as a club to stop their fighting. The blood smell was strong for them, and they wanted to fight. "Ha!" he snorted. "We are tough now, are we? When we smell the hot guts, we are all tough." The deer was heavy, and he had to work hard to get her carcass loaded on the sled. When he had her on and tied it in, he put the liver and the heart in the open cavity, washed his hands in the snow, and put mittens back on. As long as he'd been working on the deer, her body heat had kept him warm, but he now realized that it was getting very cold and his hands had lost function in moments. They hurt as the mitts warmed them, and he smiled with the cold pain. He thought of cold not as an enemy, but as many different kinds of friend, or a complicated ally. Cold brought the first ice to the sea, the first strong ice so they could get out and hunt seals. Cold brought the fattening up of game so it was good to eat. It brought snow and made everything clean. It made storing meat and fish easy. Cold could kill as well, but if fairly treated, if treated as a friend, and if caution was taken, cold was good. Russell's fingers took pain for a time. From his friend, the cold, and he smiled with it. Smiled with the deer on the sled, and the cold and the dogs. The dogs out in front, coming around in a large curve, heading back for the village with the deer and the ptarmigan. The dogs moving in the dark, silently, with the hot lungs in their bellies, and the joy on them from the kill. The dogs with their shoulders curving over and down with the weight of the deer. And Russell pulling back against them as they fought up the hill. Fought up with lunges and heaves to pull the sled over at last onto the crown of the ridge. In the distance you could see the lights of the village from the ridge height. It was about 10 miles away, but the night was clear and cold now, and almost still. The wind was dying off with the cold and darkness. Knowing they could spend another night in their kennel, the dogs picked up the speed, even with the weight of the deer, until they were moving in a steady, easy lope that would cover the distance to the village in 30 minutes. Russell was full of the night and the dogs as they ran, and he felt himself go out to the dogs, out ahead. At first he didn't understand it, couldn't define it enough to give it form. But in moments the feeling grew, and in his mind he gave it words, moving words, dog words. Out before me they go, taking me home. Out before me they go, I am the dogs. He realized that was a part of a song moving through the dark toward the village lights. He wondered if it was part of his song, and decided that it might be. He would make it grow. Tonight in the village, he would let it be known that he was a new person, not the old Russell. And he would tell the story to Ugruk and anybody who would listen, the story of how he took the deer with the arrow that flew across the dark. And the telling would become part of the song.